Hey everybody, this time I got 5 short questions via Gab and Minds. Links to follow me in Gab and Minds are also below. Really glad I added that option. Um, but before I get to the main questions, let me add a few corrections. Yeah, the last video there was a few inconsistencies, a few inaccuracies. Um, let's see, the Sumerians are not Semitic. Um, Pazuzu was worshipped by the Assyrians, not the Sumerians. And I mentioned that right after I recorded the video because I realized it almost at the end of actually recording. I meant to say um, Asuras, not Devas, and as such, the Asir, not the. And I even said Vanir instead of Vasir. So, woof, yeah, I ran out of steam near the end. I was kind of pressed for time. I was thinking, oh my god, this video is going to be too long. But okay, to ensure that this one doesn't get too long, let me get those 5 questions out. Okay, how are arachnids different from insects and crustaceans? That is a specialty of mine. So here we go. Uh, Arachnids are actually very different from insects and crustaceans, and this comes the reason why this question is even being asked is because the last video I mentioned how similar crustaceans and insects were. Let's first compare crustaceans and insects and see what they have in common, because that's interesting in and of itself. They both have, in terms of mouth parts, they have what are called mandibles. So mandibles are, for the most part, chewing mouth parts. In insects, they go all over the place. They end up modifying them a great deal. They're sucking mouth parts and slashing mouth parts and so forth. But they all have a lot of similarities to actually the human jaw. They have side plates called maxillae, a top plate called a labrum, and a bottom plate called a labium. And those are the 4 sort of cornerstones of the mandibles. And you see this in crustaceans, and you see this in insects. And the chief way of looking at it is first and foremost as a chewing mouth part, even though you can look at those modifications. The ideal, in my opinion, is kind of funny. I mentioned grasshoppers last time. That's sort of the best uh, first insect to look at if you want to like really analyze the mouth of an insect, because it's sort of like a good template. Additionally, crustaceans and insects have compound eyes. Insects also, in their adult form, in addition to compound eyes, have simple eyes as well. Usually 3 simple eyes located on top of the head, and then 2 major compound eyes that comprise of just hundreds, perhaps thousands of separate lenses called omnitidium. And you see this in crustaceans, and you see this in insects. Lastly, they have sensory organs known as antennae, and everybody's familiar with antennae. They've seen them in virtually every insect species and every crustacean species. In crabs, they're tiny, and in lobsters, they're much longer. And then in moths, you see those lovely, on the males in particular, those plumate, they're feathery-looking antennae. Um, and then you look at arachnids, and things change a lot. There's no antennae. Their eyes are always simple, whether they're immature or adult. Uh, and the mouth parts are the big one. Arachnids and Xyphosura, which is, shoot, what's the common name for that? What do regular normies call them? Oh, horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs. They are known as chelicerates, and that has to do with their mouth parts. And I wish that at some point, I guess I need to get a dry erase board to convey things easier, because this is going to be, I'm going to have to use my hands to show what chelicerae are like. Instead of those complicated chewing mouth parts, arachnids have a much more simple setup. They have what are known as chelicerae. So let me raise my hand up. Imagine that these two, man, I gotta get used to that these 2 fingers are chelicerae. So right here you have sort of a barrel-shaped muscle, and then on the other side you have a second barrel-shaped muscle, and then beneath it you have fangs. That's pretty much the layout for every single arachnid's mouth parts. And as well as horseshoe crabs. And the way that they digest things is by, for the most part, I mean, just about every arachnid is predatory. There's very few exceptions to that. What they do is they envenomate their prey, and it breaks them down. Digestion takes place outside, and then they suck it up through a mouth that's below the chelicerae. That's really just an opening that sort of vacuums the liquid up. It's almost the way our diaphragm and mouth are set up with regard to breathing. So yeah, very different. in that sense. Oh, also, I didn't even think of that. Insects, they respire through spiracles, little holes that directly sort of interface with the atmosphere, whereas arachnids, for the most part, have book lungs, which are, they also interface directly, but similarly more to the way gills work. It's interesting stuff. Okay, I gotta speed this up because there are more questions. What if, oh, I love this one. What if you swam in vodka? And I'm sure whoever thought of that, they were imagining like a rich person with a yacht and a big pool full of, I don't know, what's a nice vodka brand? Grey Goose or something. And, okay, well, what would happen? Well, first of all, have you ever been to the doctor? I'm sure you have. Have you ever gotten a shot? I'm also sure you have. And what happens when they take that cotton ball and they put alcohol on it and they rub it on your arm? What happens? First thing you notice is your arm gets a lot colder. That's because alcohol is a great solvent, and solvents evaporate quickly. And when things evaporate quickly and you put them on a warm-blooded creature like ourselves, it lowers the temperature of that corresponding area. So if you swam in alcohol, assuming you don't freeze to death within a few minutes, then you'd probably drown anyway because you're also a lot denser than the alcohol. So it wouldn't be good. It wouldn't even be something. I don't think anybody. I don't know if anybody's tested this, but I don't think you could pull it off for even a minute. I really mean that. I don't think you could manage for even a minute. I'm actually drinking mugwort tea at the moment, which is really great. It helps with lucid dreams, and it causes really vivid, crazy dreams. In a good way. In a good way. I really like mugwort tea. Recommend it. Let's see. Question number 3. Can I grow an apple tree from the grocery? Whoa, talk about typos. From the grocery apple. I heard they were sterile. Well, you heard wrong, but I don't recommend it. And I actually grow apple trees, and it's pretty complicated because apple trees have the most insane genetics ever. I mean, it's kind of staggering, really. Apples are just genetically so unstable. They're the weirdest thing. Okay, let me start by saying that you can't let two apple trees of the same cultivar mix. They like okay, hypothetically, let's say you have a pink lady. That's my favorite apple cultivar right now. And you have another pink lady. And you plant them next to each other, and you grow them, and then you take the apples and you take the seeds out and you plant them in the ground. You're going to get a pink lady, right? No, you are not. You're going to get something totally different because anytime apple trees reproduce sexually, the genes just sort of it's like a slot machine every time. You get a whole bunch of variation. All the apple trees that you see, the different cultivars, they're created not through pollination, but through a process known as making science. What you do is you take a stem, or not a stem, like a twig, whatever, a growth from the branch of an apple tree, and you cut the bottom off of it, sort of skin it a little bit, and then you add, if possible, you don't actually have to do this like 100%, but you can add a material that helps encourage root formation, and then you put that in a plastic bag and you wait for roots to grow, and then you put it in the ground. So you're cloning them. All the apple cultivars are just clones. You know, if you're growing Macintosh, it's a clone of another Macintosh tree. Additionally, those trees also will not bear fruit unless they have another cultivar planted near them that flowers at the same rough time, and then you need then you need a pollinator to help with the pollination. So it's just crazy. You got to have two different cultivars and a pollinator, generally speaking, honeybees, or bumblebees, or carpenter bees, a kind of pollinator, in other words. So it's really complicated just to get apples, and those are apples that you can't even plant. Well, you can plant them, but you don't know what you're going to get. You never know what you're going to get when you put an apple in the ground. Pretty much every time you plant an apple seed and a tree is cultivated from it, it's a new tree. It's a new cultivar. So why doesn't everybody do this? because most of the time they're bad. Like really, that's the deal. Most of the time, if you just plant an apple seed in the ground, you're going to get something new, but it's probably not going to be very tasty. But hey, I mean, if you want to roll the dice and take the risk, maybe you'll end up with the next greatest apple cultivar, and then everybody will want science off of it. So that answers that one. Let's see. Question number 4. Ooh, what is altruism? This comes from the fact that I mentioned that mice or rats were altruistic. Altruism, oh boy. Well, there are 4 relationships in nature, biological relationships. Actually, I'm not going to drink any more mugwort tea because when I talk, the mugwort tea that gets stuck to my mustache starts flying out. It looks like I'm spitting. Let's see. There are 4 relationships in nature. There's symbiosis, parasitism, uh, spite, and altruism. So let's analyze all of them because they're all interesting, but altruism is definitely the most interesting and certainly the most. Well, actually, spite was probably more rare, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so let's say you take 2 separate species or 2 animals within the same species. You can go either way, but it's more interesting when you take 2 separate species. And one preys on another. Who benefits and who doesn't? Obviously, the one who gets eaten does not benefit. That's very bad for them. And the one who gets the meal out of the other one, they benefit. That's what you would call parasitism. And I realize that a lot of people might be scratching their heads now saying, well, that's not exactly what parasitism. In terms of those relationships, it is. I realize that parasitism has a much more specific conceptualization, wherein an animal sort of feeds off another and without killing it. And parasitoids are more specifically ones that parasitize and results in killing. But in terms of these relationships, it's considered parasitic when one animal benefits and one animal suffers as a result. So that's the standard, really. If you look at the interaction between different species, it's almost exclusively a one-way street. You've got predators and prey, and even among herbivores, they're eating plant species. So there's a lot of that. Then you have the more interesting of the two. Sorry, I just get more uncomfortable. You have symbiosis, or sometimes called mutualism, or I think it's sometimes syndicalism. Anyway, that's when they both benefit. So a great example of that would be hermit crabs. They will take sea anemones and they'll put them on their backs and they'll walk around with them. And the reason why they do this is because things that would want to eat a hermit crab don't want to touch an anemone because they're poisonous. So that's great for the hermit crab. Well, what about the anemone? Well, now the anemone can move. It doesn't have to be stuck in one spot. Additionally, instead of having to wait for a fish to come to it, the hermit crab can actually actively, catch prey and then will feed it to the anemone. So they both benefit from that relationship. That's symbiosis. Now let's move to actually the rarest, the strangest, the one that I don't even know. I think it might even just be theoretical outside of humans because you don't see this, to my knowledge, outside of human beings. And that is spite. Spite is when both organisms suffer. It has a cost, a negative cost to both species. I mean, I'm even trying to think of a possible example. The only thing I can think of is with regard to humans. Like, say somebody has a child with another person, and then they get mad at that other person and they kill the child. Well, they've destroyed their own genetics as well as the other person's. So, that's not a case of just harming the other. You're actually harming yourself. And some people may observe that and think, well, there are a lot of instances of animals eating their young. Generally speaking, that's because they don't. It's not out of spite. Like if a mouse eats their babies, it's because they're either starving and would make more sense to try again later, or more often a predator has discovered the babies and so they're just kind of doomed because they can't move them. So it's literally a case of my babies are going to die anyway. If I eat them, I can use those calories to make more later. That's not spite. So lastly, we come to the most interesting. And this one, some people even claim isn't real. I think that's a pretty negative view of things, but I mean, they might be right, and that's altruism. Altruism is when one organism chooses to face a negative penalty so that another organism can have a positive result. In other words, a better word for it would be sacrifice. And we see this, case in point in mice. If you take a mouse that's not related at all to other mice and you put it in a laboratory setting where it's drowning, other mice will rescue it. They will put themselves at risk to save the other mouse. They've even done tests where, and actually I think it's rats, but they're real similar. I mean, in terms of behavior and evolution, they're similar. And it's probably been observed in both. And this has even happened in cases where they've actively tried, I'm not even kidding, this is truly amazing to me. They've actively tried to bribe the mice or rats into not saving the other. So what they'll do is they'll drop it in the water, the test subject B, I guess, and they'll give test subject A a treat to keep them preoccupied. So what do they generally do? Now bear in mind that these mice aren't related. See, if you're related to someone, then altruism becomes a little more iffy because you're helping your own DNA. It's kind of the way worker bees help the queen. Well, of course, she's producing children that are related to them. Anyway, but yeah, they try to reward these rodents. And what do they do? They still jump in after them. They still save the other one, foregoing the treat. And if they still have the treat afterwards, I'm not even kidding, they share it with the mouse that they've rescued. It's just amazing to me. So that's altruism. Another great example of altruism in nature, one of my favorites actually, is vampire bats. Yeah, a very maligned animal. People have a very negative view of vampire bats, but here's the thing about them. They're very small. And like us, they're homeothermic. And generally speaking, when you're very small and you're homeothermic, you have a crazy fast metabolism, which means you have to have a lot of food very often. And vampire bats, I think it's 36 hours. I might be wrong. But there's a window where they will starve. And it's a very short window. So they pretty much have to go out every night and get blood. And blood is not a very good source of nutrition. It's very nutrient poor. So they got to eat a lot of it in order to survive. And sometimes one won't find any food. And I'm talking about ones that aren't related closely to other ones in their group. So what happens? Do they just starve? No. Another member of their, whatever you call it, tribe, cluster, group, herd, I don't know what you call a group of bats. It's not like a murder of crows, I don't think. They will actually regurgitate blood into the mouth of one of their peers or whatever, one of their friends, and save their life, even though that means that the very next day they absolutely got to get some blood because they've just halved their own intake for the day. So that's altruism, that's sacrifice. And when people talk about humans, the iconic one that I've always heard described is when a soldier jumps on a grenade. In other words, they blow themselves up to ensure the survival of the rest of the squad. It's one of those cases where it's like, if I ran now, maybe I could survive. But there's a good chance we'll all die. Better just make it me. Now, bear that in mind. Whenever you have a group of soldiers together in a trench, they can all grow very close to each other. But they're not related. They're not in the same family. There's no genetic benefit. And when people talk about cost and benefit in evolutionary behavior, it almost exclusively applies to calories and genetics. You try to get as many calories as you can and pass on your DNA. That's fitness. That's the motivation of every living thing. So to go against that for another, it defies explanation. And that's really what altruism is. It is the most fascinating and interesting of all the relationships in nature, because it almost seems, this sounds cheesy, but it almost seems connected to divinity. It seems like something greater than what nature would dictate should happen. So I hope that clears that up. That's what altruism is. Last question. What is, and oh, of course, I've used this word way too much the last video. What is etymology? Etymology is the study of language. And it's, more importantly, it's the study of how words come about, the origins of words. And it's absolutely fascinating. It reminds me of a joke, actually, because I'm really into entomology, too. which is the study of insects. What's the difference between an etymologist and an entomologist? An etymologist knows the difference. That's a joke that I heard some time ago. Anyway, but yeah, etymology is fascinating because not only does it tell you the origins of words, which are often very interesting and almost labyrinthian in and of themselves, but in some ways, up until 20, 30 years ago, it was really the most effective way to understand where a people came from. I mean, no joke, because if you wanted to know, well, who's closer in relation, French and Germans or English and French or English and Germans, or is there a connection between the Swedes and the people of the subcontinent of India? You couldn't test their DNA for most of human history. It wasn't something you could do, but you could look at the evolution of language, and language evolves almost just like an animal does. Just like if you look at a fossil record and you can see subtle changes through the generations, you can see the same thing with language. And so you can trace these trees, and there are different family trees. There's the Indo-European family tree, or language tree. There's the Sino-Japanese language tree. There's the Bantu African, I think it's called the Bantu Khoisan language tree, but don't quote me on that one, because that one, yeah, I might have to make a correction in the next video for what I just said. And then there's also American Indian lingual trees, which are absolutely riddled with holes right now, unfortunately, because so many American Indian and Inuit languages have gone extinct. So yeah, it's really interesting stuff, and you can learn a great deal about sort of the roots of a culture and how they passed through and how they migrated over the course of human history all over the world by looking at changes in syntax, in language, in words. Really interesting stuff, and I highly recommend people look into that. I mean, really, the best way to do it is if a word gets in your head that's interesting, just go to a search engine and say, what is the etymology of, and then that word, and you'll just fall down a rabbit hole. It's really interesting stuff. So yeah, that answers the 5 questions, and yeah, don't forget to follow me on Gab and Minds, and look forward to everybody watching the next video. Look forward to getting some more questions. Thanks.